Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Over the next 3 weeks, we are going to be talking about theory. For those of you that have had the class criminology, this is going to be somewhat of a review. If you have not had criminology, excuse me, this is going to be basically a preview of what criminology is about. Now, over the next 3 weeks, we are going to be talking about criminology, and I've kind of mixed and matched. And so if a theory doesn't sound familiar or based on what you've read for this week, no, it's going to be a theory that we're going to talk about next week. I kind of group the theories in how they make sense to me, and so that's how I'm going to present them to you. So the material that I'm going to cover this week covers performance objectives 2, 4, and 5 as listed in your syllabus. And so today we're going to be really focusing on some of the individual views of delinquency, and then this week we're also going to be talking about some of the sociological views of delinquency or criminological theories that apply to juvenile justice. And so we're going to be talking about rational choice, routine activities, a category known as trait theories, so I'll explain that in just a little bit, some of the issues and concerns of these theories, as well as our key takeaways for these theories. So let's get started. And again, for those of you that have not had criminology, I want to just give you a brief overview of what criminology is. It's really a study of theories that have been used to figure out why someone commits crime, with the overall goal of understanding it. If we can understand why something is happening, then we can do something to prevent it. It's the same process used in the medical field. If we can understand why someone gets a disease or some type of illness, yes, we want to be able to deal with that and treat it, but we also look at things that might be able to prevent it. You know, lung cancer is a great example. We know smoking can lead up to lung cancer, and so how can we prevent someone from smoking? Criminology is looking at this from a crime. We are not providing excuses. In criminology, I teach that class as well, and I keep saying over and over, this is not providing someone excuses. We need to hold folks accountable, but this is the study to try to understand why or what might lead someone up to committing crime, specifically to this class, juveniles. Ultimately, criminology can really be categorized as biological, psychological, and sociological. So we're going to look at those over the next couple weeks, specifically to juvenile justice. And so ultimately, the first group of theories that we're going to look at is going to be based on the individual. We're going to look at someone's biology, their psychology, and ultimately how they make decisions. So first and foremost, one of the probably predominant theories in criminal justice is known as the choice theory. Now, this was developed in the 1800s by Cesar Beccaria, actually in 1764. He wrote a book called On Crime and Punishment. And ultimately what he talked about in his book is that the bottom line is humans are rational. As far as the animal life goes, we're one of the few animals that are rational and have free will. We have the ability to make choices. He also recognized that humans are hedonistic. We try to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. However, humans also tend to be utilitarian. We look at things as what's in it for me, what's the utility, what's the benefit that can be obtained from something. He also took a look at the economics of crime, where ultimately he believed that folks are going to commit crime because they believe the benefits outweigh any potential costs. So economics is looking at benefits and costs, and so he believed that folks make a conscious decision that the benefits are going to exceed the costs, and so they're going to commit the crime. If they believe the costs exceed the benefits, they won't. Now that leads us to a discussion of what is known as routine activities. Now routine activities uses what is known as the crime triangle. What that crime triangle, so if you look at here, we have, oops, let me get my pointer. So we have the problem. In this case, it's going to be the crime. And basically, we know for any crime, when we break down crime to its most basic sense, we know that crime includes a target, who is ultimately the victim. We know that it has to have an offender and a place. And ultimately, if all three of these aren't present, we're not going to have a crime. So if there is a woman walking alone down a dark alley, and so we have the victim, and we have the place being the dark alley, and there's no offender present, nothing's going to happen. You know, similar to if we have an offender hiding in that dark alley, but no one walks by, we're not going to have a crime. So that's looking at crime in its most simplistic manner. Ultimately, then, we know we can take that out one step further. Many victims have a guardian, not walking alone down that dark alley. Many places also have a manager. Who's responsible for that alley? Can there be lights installed? Those types of things. We also know that most offenders are working for someone. They have what is known as a handler. And so ultimately, how can we manage or how can we deal with that handler? Because if the offender doesn't have anyone to sell their stuff to, then that benefits isn't going to exceed the, you know, there's not going to be that benefit there. So ultimately, one of the things that we really look at is the role of the guardian. And not that we're blaming the victim, but sometimes we need to be smarter. And so we know that targets are becoming easier because of, in some instances, a lack of that capable guardian. We also know that some offenders are becoming more and more motivated. So these are the things that really we need to take a look at when we're talking about those individual choice theories. So based on that theory, really when we talk about it, we should be looking at, in our penalties, how can we punish, or excuse me, how can we prevent and not punish? How can we make the costs higher? This is really going back to some other classes. This is really taking a look at specific and general deterrence. How can we convince that individual offender to not commit this crime? And then how can we send a message to the general public that crime doesn't pay? That's general deterrence. Cesar Beccaria recommended in order to achieve that, the penalty must be certain, swift, and severe. And so, and of course, we know that we struggle in all of those aspects. I'm sorry, I just realized I didn't have my webcam on. All right, so ultimately one of the other things that we're going to do is situational crime prevention. And so with that, again, going back to that triangle, one of the things we can do is called target hardening. How can we make it harder to be a target? Increasing our guardian, being smarter. Not that we need to have our house, locked up tight, but how can we make it less likely to become a target? That might involve increasing guardians, but then also we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to prevent offenders from becoming offenders, and then also if we're not able to prevent, how can we hold them accountable? So really the choice theory makes it very, very simple. Criminals have a choice. And deep down, we know that that's the truth. They could always choose differently. But is it really that simple, or do we need to take it to another level? So that next level is going to be what we call biosocial theories as well as psychological theories. So let's take a look first at what is known as biosocial. This is really a combination of biology and the environment, the social environment that someone grows up in. However, we also know that there are some what we call biochemical issues here. Folks that do drugs or drink alcohol during pregnancy, we know that creates a biochemical environment that can cause some types of disabilities and illnesses in their unborn child. We also know the importance of taking or getting essential vitamins and minerals in the development of that unborn child. And so those are biochemical aspects. We also know once that child is born, sometimes being in contact with some contaminants. One of the things we struggle with is exposure to the lead. Now, I'm not talking your basic lead pencil. Now, lead hasn't been allowed in paint in many, many years. However, we know that many folks live in low-income housing. Those housing areas might still have lead paint. And the paint chips, a child ingests that, that level of lead contaminant can lead to developmental issues. Children exposed to lead have lower IQs and higher impulsivity rates. We also know that there's some neurological things that can be a factor. Prenatal issues that I just talked about can also lead to some neurological problems. Those folks, especially very young children who have suffered brain injuries, can lead to some neurological issues that might lead them to delinquency. One of the things we're going to be talking about all quarter is frontal lobe development. We know that the frontal lobe, some research is saying that frontal lobe is not fully developed until age 25. The frontal lobe is what monitors and regulates your impulse control. If that's not fully developed, a child might know the difference between right and wrong, but can't control their impulses. We also know there are some genetic aspects, things that are passed on from the parent to the child. We see this in different types of antisocial behavior, from things like educational levels or educational abilities, those types of things. Sometimes we see that as genetic. But remember, we're doing all of this research in hindsight. Remember, our hindsight is 20/20, and really it's an ethical dilemma in what we're going to do with this. So, for example, if we know that someone or a child was born and their mother, did drugs, addicted to alcohol, so this child is born with fetal alcohol syndrome. We also know that they had high exposure to lead, and so they have fetal alcohol syndrome, a low IQ, and difficulty in controlling their impulses. We also know that, let's say, for example, dad assaulted or abused the child and caused a brain injury. What do? We know this child now the child is still functioning, but we know the likelihood of them becoming delinquent is very high. What do we do? And so those are some of the things that we really need to take into consideration and why we study theory. Now, one of the most cited theories out there is known as the social learning theory. And basically, this theory is really quite simple. It says that crime, just like every other behavior, so as you teach a child how to walk, how to eat by themselves, every other thing that we teach a child, every other behavior, crime is also learned. Now, one of the predominant theories here was created by Edward Sutherland in 1939, known as differential association. And basically, he is saying that crime, just like other behavior, is learned, and we learn this from those around us. We learn the techniques. We learn to have a positive attitude about committing crime, saying, no, this isn't wrong. This is what we need to do to get what we want. And so it's just a different association, what we might not consider norm or normal. Social differential association also includes the concepts of reinforcement and modeling. Reinforcement is basically just saying that a behavior is rewarded, and so it's repeated. So, stealing from Target, if that behavior is rewarded, that person is going to repeat it. We also see modeling. We imitate behaviors that we see. And so one of the things that really frustrates me, to be honest, is the whole adage of do as I say, not as I do. Basically, for example, and I'm not picking on anyone, if a parent smokes but tells the kid not to, what we say or what we do is more influential than what we say. And so if mommy says it's bad but does it, mommy wouldn't lie to me. And so behavior, actions, speak much louder than words. And the same goes for crime and committing crime. And so if a parent or a child witnesses mom and dad committing crime, that's modeling behavior. It's going to be considered acceptable. Behavior theories also applies to violent media, and this is something that we're going to talk about throughout the quarter as well. And ultimately, one of the things that the American Psychological Association, so the APA, and the AAP, which is the American Academy of Pediatrics. So psychologists and pediatricians both agree and have done multiple studies, and basically kids that are exposed to violence in the media basically demonstrate or can demonstrate 5 different findings. First, that they're less sensitive to pain and suffering of others. When you see something over and over again, you kind of become immune to it. They can also become fearful of the world around them. You know, the violence in the media shows a pretty scary place, and if they think that's everywhere, you know, that can be challenging. Aggressive towards each other. This kind of goes with the last one in that if aggression is what they see and that's how we solve problems, that's what they're going to mimic. Become immune, I've already talked about that a little bit with the first one, and then accepting violence as a way to solve problems. They see that's how it's done, and so that's what they do. All right, we also see psychology as a predominant criminological category or classification of theories, and really psychology is looking at someone's personality. And so I have just a definition. Personality is a word that everybody kind of knows what it means, but struggle to actually put a definition to it. So what's listed first on this slide is an example or a definition of personality. It's our patterns of behaviors, thoughts, and emotions that reflect characteristic ways of adapting demands and problems. When you think of someone's personality, that's really what we're thinking about. So with that, we know that there's what we would consider normal personalities, and then we also have what is known as antisocial personality disorder. Now, this is a psychological disorder that's actually, it's being overused right now. It's kind of the catch-all. But really what we're referring to is behaviors that don't conform. Now, there's, you know, whether that's behaviors that they have modeled, what their parents are doing, or if it's based in some biology or neurology. Either or, we most often see it as a reflection of parents, but sometimes we see it as some neurological based on that biology. So things like ADHD, ODD, anxiety, depression. And so we see kind of a combination of issues that lead to this antisocial personality disorder. With that, especially when we're talking about the media, there's been over 1,000 studies done by the APA and the AAPA, and all lead to those similar findings. And so we believe that there is some credit to be given to that issue. Some of the issues we have with some of this research, however, is as it applies to juveniles, we are only studying adjudicated or incarcerated youth. And so our sample is already a little bit skewed there because these are kids who have already demonstrated that they have issues because they're involved in the juvenile justice system. We also need to take into consideration the self-report studies. Now, we talked about this in Module 1. Remember that crime, for the most part, juvenile delinquency, for the most part, is universal. Everybody has done something that, if they had been caught, could have been arrested or brought into the system. So when we know that only 3% actually are, you know, are those really just the unfortunate 3%? One of the things that this research doesn't take into consideration is the role of the community. And we know that there's great variation, or we'll talk about that over the next weeks as well. And so those are pretty important considerations that should be taken into account. So ultimately, some of the key takeaways we have with this is to remember that crime prevention really happens prenatally. And so how can we help women who are pregnant understand the challenges of drug use and get them the help they need in smoking and alcohol, and then taking, you know, prenatal vitamins and having healthy nutrition. So really it does begin prenatally. We know that if we can strengthen someone's home lives and their relationships and have more normal behaviors within our family lives and communities, we know that that's going to help. We know that parents can also be our best success modelers and our biggest problem modelers. And so we need to be cognizant of both of those roles. And we also always need to remember that hindsight is 20/20. it's really easy to look back and say, oh yeah, that child started demonstrating problem behaviors at age 3. We know that that might be the issue, but just because a 3-year-old is demonstrating problem behaviors doesn't mean that they're going to become delinquent. So we always need to be really careful with that. All right, moving on to talking about some of the more social theories, or what we call sociological criminology. This really applies to all of the performance objectives of the syllabus. And so we're going to talk a little bit about social structure theories, social control theories, and then the implications, kind of the key takeaways and issues with this type of research. So the first theory within this category is known as, or within social structure, it's really looking at social class. But it's important to understand that social class involves more than money. Most people take a look at someone's income and says, you know, that's what determines their social class. Well, they're low class, middle class, or in the upper class. We have to understand, though, as related to this theory, it goes much deeper than that. Yes, social class, financial status plays a big role in social structure and in social class, but we also need to take a look at the shared attitudes, the values, the lifestyle, kind of what's normal within these communities, because that's going to tell us a lot about the issues in those communities. We also need to take into consideration that there are 12 million children living in poverty, and that snowballs. That impacts our education. Kids in high poverty areas have lower test scores and graduation rates. Healthcare is an issue, both in preventative as well as you know, dealing with illnesses. We know that copay, some families simply can't afford the copay, and so we tend to ignore problems, which can lead to bigger health problems. We also know that multi-housing, so living in an apartment, very few folks that live in poverty own their own home or are able to rent a home of their own. There's actually a really interesting study, and I actually was even dealing with this with my own family. Psychology of space. There is a study that says everyone living in a house needs about 300 square feet of room for their ultimate or optimal mental health. And so a family of 4 for optimal health should be living in a space that's at least 1,200 square feet. We know that that's absolutely rarely the case in low-income housing. And so those are some of the things that we need to think about when we're talking about these social structure theories. One of the predominant social disorganization theory out there is called, or one of the predominant sociological theories is called social disorganization. And this theory makes so much sense to me. It's also often referred to as criminology of place, or the Chicago School of Criminology, mainly because the theory was developed in Chicago. So basically, this theory looks at cities, and many of you can even apply this to your own city. I know I live in St. Cloud, Minnesota, and this theory loosely can be applied. So basically, when we look at the city, it is composed of concentric, what we call concentric zones. So in the middle here is known as the loop. This is going to be the business district. Very few people live in the business, in the heart of the city where there's mainly just business and tourist attractions. The few people that do live there, it's generally above, in an apartment above a building, and it's very, very low income. Outside of that is known as the zone of transition. This is folks that are living in poverty, and this is where some of our very lowest income folks are going to live. Just outside of that is once folks are earning enough, can move to maybe not quite the suburbs, but a little bit further away from that loop, a little better housing and socioeconomic class. And then the fourth, and beyond the fourth, is the zone of the middle class. This is where most folks live, where crime is relatively low. So as we get closer and closer to the inner city, crime increases. But what this particular theory is looking at is this zone of transition, this red area. And what the theory is basically saying is that this zone is generally comprised of low-income housing, high crime rates. It's that inner city zone. A lot of times immigrants, when they first move here, they will live in this zone, and as soon as they are established, they will move out. And basically, so this zone of transition is very transitional. People are moving in and out very, very quickly. So there's very little sense of community because you don't know your neighbors. And there's very few social ties. And what's really interesting is, so this area has the highest crime rates no matter who lives there. People are moving in and out. People of all different nationalities, all different, personal struggles are living here, and it doesn't matter who lives here, the crime remains constant. And so we need to really take a look at it. Okay, so what is it about that area that leads to crime? And that's why we call this criminology of place. So as an example, so I live in St. Cloud, Minnesota. Minneapolis is about 50 minutes, it's about an hour away. And we know that 3% of Minneapolis is responsible for about 50% of the calls for service received from Minneapolis PD. And we look at that 3% geographic area, it is, for the most part, found in this zone of transition. And so this theory makes a lot of sense in a lot of applications. We also know that there are subcultural theories. And basically, this is the primary theory that's used to explain gangs. So we already talked a little bit about social class and what that all includes. And really, those shared values and beliefs lead to different norms. What's normal in an inner city neighborhood is completely different than what's normal in my neighborhood. And sometimes the folks living there have what we call status frustration. They don't see a way out. They don't see the opportunities in those outside areas because nobody is modeling that for them. One of the other things about this theory is called focal concerns. And basically these focal concerns are, again, different sets of values. And a lot of times those values encourage delinquency. So one of the studies that was done looked at gang members, and their definition of success was completely different than a middle-class kid's definition of success. Their definition of tough and being smart. Smart was not book smart, was not doing well in school. It was street smart. Excitement. What they did for fun and what was exciting is completely different than those middle-class kids. The idea of fate. Middle to upper-class kids believe that they control their fate. Inner-city kids, gang members, don't see it, that they don't see that they're in control of their fate. These gang members also have an amazing sense of autonomy. They look out for number one, and they can't care what's happening to others. Because they need to watch out for number one. So again, some really interesting applications and implications of juvenile delinquency. Tied in with that is known as the strain theory and this concept of anomie. Anomie is basically where we don't know what's normal because they keep changing or they're not well defined. So I live in a middle class neighborhood, and our norms, what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, is very, very well defined. In these inner city areas, there is no norm, and they're in a state of anomie, and things are always changing, and we don't know what's normal. This also influences the American dream. So, of course, I grew up on a farm, but was always taught about if I worked hard and went to school and got an education, I could have, the house with the white picket fence and 2.2 kids, and that's the American dream. Inner city kids don't understand, they don't see it, and it doesn't seem available to them. And so that leads obviously to many, many problems. All right, shifting gears a little bit. Social control theories really takes a unique perspective, and this is something that we'll be talking about a lot this quarter as well. In talking about, instead of trying to figure out why kids commit crime, let's look at why kids don't. And what about their lives make them different? One of the key theories here is the containment theory. It was created by Walter Reckless, Dr. Reckless, and basically he says when you think of the phrase, I can hardly contain myself, you know, I can hardly hold back. And so really what the containment theory is, what around us holds us back? What contains us from those outside influences? And we know that there is outer containment or what is known as external containment. And basically this is group, what I like to call positive group peer pressure. So this is the folks around us. You know, I look at like my boys' friends. They are surrounded by kids whose families have very similar values to us and are really focused on doing the right thing. And so that's that outer containment saying, no, this is the right thing to do and this is what we should do. But then we also know we have inner containment. So these are things within ourselves. So a positive self-image, having a conscience, a sense of responsibility, not easily frustrated. These are things within ourselves that keep us or buffers or insulates us from those outside negative influences. Travis Hershey developed probably what is the most popular social control theory. In his book, I actually read this book. This dates me. I wasn't that old, but this was one of the textbooks we used in one of my college juvenile justice classes. It was one of the, we had like 3 textbooks, and my professor loved Travis Hershey and used that book, and rightly so. So basically the social bond theory says, again, what keeps kids from committing crime, and those are the things that we should really focus on. And so he looked at the attachment that kids have to their family and to their community and to their friends, and that attachment will keep kids from crime. Their commitment. Basically, he used a quote that has, the more one has, the more one has to lose. And so the more committed that someone is to something, the more likely they're going to follow through with it. Kids who are involved. Time spent, you know, idle hands are the devil workshops. I firmly believe that. Keeping kids involved. We are so busy right now with chauffeuring our kids around to activities. And both my husband and I are completely okay with that because we know that kids who are really involved are less likely to become delinquent. Kids also need to believe it. They have to have respect for the law. They have to understand this larger context, the role of society, and belief in the system and our society and our communities to really have buy-in. So again, the social bond theory is what Travis Hershey is saying is kids that don't have these 4 things are ultimately what causes delinquency. With these types of theories, where we see this being implemented in our communities, in our legislatures, as well as policies and procedures, we really want to focus on how can we strengthen our components? How can we help families be stronger and have more access to what we consider these pro-social norms? How can we improve our schools in the testing and you know, inspiration of some of these inner city schools? How can we have good peer relationships? Build those, have those friends. You know, to be honest, there's a couple boys in each of my son's classes that I'm not going to encourage play dates, although my oldest says I can't call it play dates anymore, they hang out. But, you know, having good peer relationships and a strong sense of community. And ultimately, how for some, how can we unlearn their behaviors, unlearn nonconformity? You know, if that's where they came from, how can we undo it? All right, so that wraps up a review of the content. So I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about the assignments for this week. So the reading, there is a section of the textbook you need to read, as well as a journal article and other links. Again, all of that is fair game. Please make sure you read Monday's announcement because I review everything that we're doing this week. The writing assignment this week focuses on youth programs. Your assignment, again, the announcement is going to provide further clarification as well as the rubric that I'll be using to grade. You need to provide at least 2 youth programs, and in your discussion, it needs to have a summary of the program, who's the target population, and what is the program goals. You also need to incorporate responsibility. Whose responsibility is it to offer these programs? Make sure you're supporting your opinion there. The discussion forum is going to talk about social structure. So I just talked about those theories. So you need to explain how those theories apply to juvenile justice and how, as our society changes, we know our society is changing greatly throughout the years. You know, I was actually just talking with my husband. Our internet went down. And so actually just this morning, woke up, went to check my phone, and wasn't connected to Wi-Fi. And my son couldn't get on his iPad, and he needed to check, you know, I don't know, one of his sports apps. And he was like, well, Mom, I can't get on my iPad. And it was like a major issue for him. And so really looking at how our society changes. So do these theories still apply? These theories were created, you know, many, many years ago. Do they still apply as our society changes? All right, this week you're also going to choose your project for your topic. Now, the project is a persuasive essay, and it has pre-established goals. So your project needs to look at, is going to be a research paper basically on the history of your topic, the current status of your topic, the benefits, the drawbacks, and your opinion. That's what a persuasive essay does. The link in the content folder for that is basically idea starters. They're not necessarily holistic topics. Those are just things to get kind of the ball rolling in your brain. So I'm going to give you a few more specific topics. So again, as a persuasive essay, you could look at the DARE program or the GREAT program. And as a persuasive essay, you're going to talk about you know, here's why DARE is the greatest drug prevention program out there, or why GREAT is the greatest prevention, or any other program that you might want to research, or might even have some inside knowledge and want to further your knowledge about it. You could look at a program used in a detention center. 2 examples, and these are just 2 examples. There's many more. One of them is known as True Thought. The other is known as Thinking for Change. You could also look at the death penalty. Keep in mind that in 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court in Roper versus Simmons declared that the death penalty for juveniles is unconstitutional. So if you can still look at the death penalty, but keep that in mind when you're doing your research. You could look at a specific diversion program. I've had students look at drug court or teen court or other types of diversion programs out there. You could look at some interventional programming. 2 examples, and again, there's lots more. Multi-systemic therapy, functional family therapy are 2 examples that I've had students use and do a really good job with. So these are a little bit more specific recommendations. Again, the link is just general ideas, and so I wanted to give you a little bit more specific. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. I'm always here to answer questions. So have a great week, and I will see you soon.